Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for another episode of The Ghost Furnace. I am Bond. I am not joined by my cohort Nick Pennsylvania tonight. He is busy, but I am not flying solo. I am here with our new friend and author and podcaster, Brennan Storr. How you doing, Brennan?
I'm good, man. I'm good. Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, no, we're super pumped to be chatting with you this evening. I wanted to talk about mainly about a book that you wrote that I've read that I was really excited about. And the book is called A Strange Little Place, The Paranormal Secrets of Revelstoke, British Columbia. And this was something that whenever I picked it up, I really enjoyed it right off the bat. Shared it with a few friends,
Thank you.
a few listeners, got some really good feedback, and I was like, you know what, I'm going to reach out and see if this gentleman wants to chat. So, really excited to be speaking with you this evening about this book and your experiences and kind of your story in general. So,
Yeah, I'm stoked. I was honored you asked, and I'm happy to be here.
awesome.
We'll have to come on another time so I can meet Nick.
Right, exactly. Absolutely. Yeah. Hopefully first of many occasions tonight. Just to kind of like get in and set the stage for everybody. I had never heard of Revelstoke, British Columbia before hearing about your book, before reading it.
That's right.
And that's kind of the focal point and the nexus of this book is the town, or the town. Is it a city or is it a town? It's a city, correct?
Oh,
Technically.
it's a town. It's about 7,500 people.
Okay, so that's good context. And that's kind of the nexus of where all these stories kind of center around. So, and this is something that rang true for me, and I think will for a lot of our listeners. Can you give everyone just like a brief overview of like what Revelstoke is and kind of like its, just the highlights of its history and where it is and what it's about?
Yeah, so Revelstoke's my hometown. I lived there for the first 24 years of my life, maybe just under that. It's in Western Canada. It's on the Trans-Canada Highway, so it runs between, I like to say it's about halfway between Vancouver and Calgary, because those are the two cities most people will recognize. It's probably a little closer to Calgary than it is Vancouver, but that kind of gives you a general sense of it.
Mm-hmm.
It's a fairly isolated place. It's one of the things I always disliked about it growing up. It's... to the west, it's about 45 minutes before you get to the next town. The road north dead ends after about 3 hours in a small community, and I mean small community, couple hundred people, I think. The road south ends in a lake, and the road east, it is about 90 to 100 minutes before you get to another town. And that road is not the best, because actually, to be honest, both east and west out of town in spring can be shut down by mudslides, and in winter can be closed by avalanches. So it can be an isolated little place.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
on all sides you've got mountains, right? So Revelstoke's at an elevation of about 1,500 feet, and you are surrounded by mountains that go up to about 9,500, 9,000. So you're surrounded by about 7,500 feet of just sheer mountain. Like you want to talk about being hemmed in.
Yeah.
Revelstoke is the place.
Wow. So that really kind of paints a picture of what we're looking at for this town. As far as its history, because it was kind of like a boom town. Or it was industrial, at least. Yeah.
It was, yeah. So there was a lot of mining, not in Revelstoke itself, but south of town in a region called the Lardo. There was a lot of prospecting down there, and there was also, it's sort of the natural place for the Trans-Canada Railroad to come through. And if you know much about the history of Canada, that was the thing that allowed Canada to be Canada. Right. And so the last spike, which was basically the finale of the railroad, that was driven just west of town. So it's a railroad. Like when I was growing up there, it was a mill town and it was a railroad town. So it was very much a working class town. That has changed some. When the big ski hill went in, because we've always had a ski hill, but when the big development finally went in, the resort went in, the makeup of the town changed dramatically. So, but when I was growing up there, the Hells Angels owned a lot of property there. A lot of property in and outside of town. Very rough and tumble place. There was a bar called the King Eddie where you used to have to check your knives in a bucket at the door before they'd let you
in. Wow, it kind of has that almost like that Wild West kind of vibe in that sense.
Yeah, I came up right at the end of that, so I didn't see. I was too young to see most of it, but. As an indication of the shift, when I was just about to enter high school, there was a newspaper article. I think it was the year before I went into high school, grade 8. There was a newspaper article about how the violence had reached a fever pitch at the secondary school And there was a person, in fact, my cousin quoted in the article as saying, "It's not a fight unless someone is bleeding."
Wow.
But a year later, it was
Jeez.
again, it was almost like a generational thing. I don't know if there's
Mm-hmm.
a lot of lead in a certain number of houses or something,
Mm-hmm.
but once I got to high school, that had all changed. So I wasn't subject to that kind of violence. But
Right.
that is what Revelstoke was. It was a
Right.
violent place. A lot of people die in alcohol related accidents because that's
Mm-hmm.
one of the few things
Prevalent.
you got to do. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of drinking, a lot of substance abuse, a lot of cocaine because again, the Hell's Angels were right
Right.
there like that. It was the DJ. He used to. He wasn't a very good DJ, but there was a nightclub, and you go out there because there's nowhere else to go,
Mm-hmm.
and the smoke machine would come on, and the dance floor would fill with smoke, and then a number of gentlemen would go down, and it is alleged engage in the marketplace of sniffable
Yeah.
ideas, and come back out,
Yeah. Yeah.
wiping their noses. So yeah, it was quite the place.
Yeah. Wow. So, but I mean, not unlike probably other industrialized towns that are on that kind of similar path, like you said.
Oh
Um,
yeah, yeah. I don't think it's unique. I think
y-
I think it's just that I know about it because I live there, and having written the book, I kind of dived into the history. But yeah, there was a lot of blood there. I mean,
mhm,
there was two fairly notable, or a seriously notable steamboat crash. The date of
mhm,
it is lost to me, but there was a section of river that called the Dal de Mor, the Death Rapids,
mhm. Yep.
and it was just north of town. And yeah, the first indication anyone had that the steamboat had capsized was a bunch of bodies
Just washing
washing
up.
washing up. Yeah, and there's a fairly infamous story again that I didn't know until I started the book of a number of I think three trappers who were
Mhm.
in a canoe and they were overturned in the Dal de Mor. All their stuff was sunk and they made it to shore. But there is some evidence that the men engaged in cannibalism to survive, and only one
Oof.
man made it out. And again, he was not very well thought of afterwards. So,
Right.
and there was again, there's a lot of violence. I mean, there was actually they called it the Farwell Police War because there was originally two settlements. There was Farwell, which is down
Mhm.
by the lower part of the city, and because they knew the railroad was going to have to come through there, the
Mhm.
people who owned Farwell, they sort of got this grand idea that okay, well these guys have to because of the mountains, they have to take the railroad through here. We're going to
Makes sense. Yeah.
jack up the prices and profiteer off this. So the railway people said, well, the heck with you, and they just built it up the hill. So that became Revelstoke. And there was Revelstoke and there was Farwell down the hill. And there was, yeah, the police actually clashed. Like
Oh,
again,
really?
yeah, yeah, yeah. Again, it's
Oh,
called the
geez.
Farwell Police War. It didn't last long, but it
Right.
was a thing. And there were murders. It was again, it's a mining town. Mining
Right.
town back then. And there's a fairly infamous story of a woman named Jenny Kihara. This is actually in the book. Yep, she was a madam, and she bought a brothel from another guy, her and her husband, and the dude took their money, and then he killed her so he could keep it and the brothel. And
Wow.
because they were immigrants, the police they didn't care.
Just didn't care about it.
No.
Yeah.
So yeah, and so that was Revelstoke. It was a
Wow.
rough place. Again, perhaps not
Mhm.
anomalously so, but still a rough place.
Right. Right. I mean, that really does do, I think, an excellent job of kind of painting the picture of like where we're looking at and what like the history of the place is, because which I think is important because one of the things that always draws me to books like yours is I love whenever people take a paranormal view of like a relatively small area or small place. It's not looking at an entire state or an entire country or an
Right.
entire region. It's like, no, here's a bunch of weird stuff that happens in this one place. And once you start kind of gathering these stories, you start thinking like, oh, is there more going on here than there is other places? And that kind of gets to one of my questions about, the activity. Is do you think that Revelstoke is uniquely active, or does it only seem that way because you kind of put that gaze on it and started to collect all of these stories?
I mean, if you had asked me earlier in the promotional cycle, I would have said no. It's totally unique by my book. Now I don't know. I mean, I think that if you put a lens up to a lot of places, if you can find people who are willing to talk to you, I think
Mm-hmm.
you're always going to learn more no matter what, right? I mean, it's
Right.
almost a cliche at this point that the small town has all the secrets, right? The whole
Right.
Twin Peaks, or the scene in Blue Velvet with the bugs, you know?
Yep.
So I mean, I think if you really examined a place closely, I think you'd probably find stories everywhere. That said, I do
hmm
think Revelstoke is unique. Is it the most? Probably not. But
hmm
who knows, right? Like we don't even really know what paranormal activity is. So I think to say a thing is the most or the least is kind of a
Right. We're kind of
pointless.
making up that scale as we go. Yeah.
100%. Yeah. We're that, or we have a TV show where we're trying to talk about portals to hell, right? Either way, it's not real useful.
Right.
But
Absolutely.
yeah. So, but I think the river has
hmm
something to do with it. And in fact, Revelstoke sits at the confluence of three rivers,
hmm
and I think that has a lot to do with it. I do think there is something to that, right? There's
Yeah.
belief that there are things that live in river valleys that kind of guard the gulf between one world and the other. And I've if there is something, I think it is that, and I think it does make Revelstoke particularly active. And I've had some experiences, especially again back kind of early on when I was
hmm
researching the book, that really kind of threw me for a loop and made me think like there's something here. And I don't like, I think it's a lot of different somethings, but I think there was also one very big something.
Right. Right. Well, and it's interesting because like that's something that we talk about a lot on this show that I thought going into your book I was going to have an idea of where this all was coming from. Like you're saying, like, oh, like the valleys are, are guarded somehow. There's the rivers. I'm thinking there's some sort of like single source, to like, okay, what happened in this town? Or is this on a ley line? Is there, like what's going on? But like you said, as you start looking at the stories, there's so much variation that the idea of pinning down like a source, quote unquote, just seems like a fruitless effort at that point.
Yeah, I think at
And
that point you're doing it so you can have a narrative as opposed to there being any
absolutely,
actual validity to it.
absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And that's why I think listening to these people's stories is so important um because when you look at how and one I really do like how you have the book broken down too, where like the stories are just kind of like you know uh not a whole lot of like necessarily like commentary on your part. There's commentary obviously, but you just kind of say what these people experienced, and a lot of them aren't like these big sweeping like narratives. There's not like this romance to like a story that has like a beginning, middle, and end. It's just like here's a person who just experienced this really wild thing, and here's how it may or may not connect to other things that have happened. There are similar stories in the area because it seems like when you start to find these things, it was like, oh, here's a weird thing that happened. Well, that sounds like this other weird thing over here. Whenever you were writing this book, obviously like you interviewed a lot of people, it seems like.
Yeah.
What was that experience like going back to, your hometown and trying to dig up not only ghost stories, but just like weird stories in general, like of high strangeness, of UFOs, of lights, how was that experience for you?
It was difficult. It was
Yeah.
weird. It was difficult. My family in Revelstoke is fairly well known.
hmm
My grandfather he was in real estate back in the day and insurance.
hmm
So a lot of older folks bought their first insurance from him when they moved to town. A lot of folks, the next generation bought their first house from him.
Right.
And my mother has worked in the community, in various capacities for 30 years.
hmm
So a lot of, and then I worked in, a family grocery store for 6 years. I worked at Radio Shack for 2.5 years.
hmm
Again, it's a small town, right? So yeah, and my dad was an epic level screw up. He's gone now, but yeah, he was an epic level screw up. So, and I look a lot like him. So
hmm
I was kind of going back into this place I'd moved from about 5 years before,
hmm
and trying to basically ask these insane questions
hmm
that I wasn't even totally sure I believed myself.
Right. Yeah.
And I was kind of just getting into the paranormal at the time. And because I was really like very much, I don't believe this stuff. It's nonsense.
hmm
I like my first girlfriend was very kind of into the woo, and I just thought it was crap. And,
Yeah.
I didn't buy it. And so I was kind of coming at this from a very different angle. And also at the time I was working for a small consulting company. I would eventually become the office manager. And so I was very mindful of my job too, right? I thought
Right,
like, hey,
right.
I don't want to say anything crazy because I'm worried I'm going to
You
lose
don't
my
want
job.
a reputation. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
So it was difficult. But I just honestly, this sounds ridiculous, but I just did what I'd read about in like PI books.
Yeah. Yeah.
I started at the museum. I was like,
Right. That's,
what
yep.
would I do if I was writing, if I was like in a detective novel, what would he do? And okay, so
Hmm.
go to the museum. So what do you know about this? And I got a name from them. And then it was like I don't know if you remember the old Gabriel Knight video games or whatever.
Hmm.
Yeah. So it was like, okay, I got a new name to go, like a new side quest. Go talk to this person. Go talk to Larry,
Right, right.
and I went from there. And I mean, prior to that, and during the process of research and writing, I read literally dozens of books about the paranormal.
Hmm.
I read
Yeah.
about, I think about 40 or 50 books
Wow.
on the paranormal. Yeah, I used to have quite the collection of paranormal books. So like I started really expanding my focus, but actually that was after I started writing
After the interviewing. Yeah.
because when I
Right.
had my first paranormal experience, it was kind of after the first research trip, and I saw a shadow person. I'd never had any kind of frame of reference for that.
Hmm.
So I remember, yeah, it would have been after I started reading the books, but yes, I just started at the museum. I had done some recon online, so I knew there were certain famous places, like like Holton House is it's always
Right.
been known as like the haunted place in
Hmm.
Revelstoke. I thought, well, I'll go to the newspaper, they'll let me see and they let me look through their archives, and that helped me. I got more information on some stuff there. I
Right.
luckily when I was living in Victoria, we live. My wife is still there. We live, I don't know, a 5-minute walk from the provincial archives, and
Oh, okay. Oh,
yes,
that's convenient.
very much so. And
Yeah.
nowadays, their archives, and this dates me, man, but their archives are all digital now. You can just search from home, but I had to physically
Hmm.
go there, and I would spend days going through microfilm
Ugh, yeah.
looking for like death records, birth certificates, trying to track down, say, for example, the family of a certain house's owners to see if I could,
Right.
if they had any stories.
Hmm.
And it was a lot of knocking on doors. So and
Yeah.
so says, "Oh man, I used to live in this house, and some stuff happened there." All right, well, go
Hmm.
knock on the door and say, "Hey, this is who I am. This is what I'm doing. Do you have any stories?" And I would say most of them were no,
Hmm.
but it took me a couple years to do this because I was living in Victoria, which is 7 hours plus a 2-hour ferry ride away. So all my vacation time for a couple years was spent doing this.
Right.
And over time, people kind of came to know me. I made friends with a guy named Dave Rooney, who the new version of the book is dedicated to.
Hmm.
He was the editor of one of the papers in town, and he was very encouraging. And he sort of had me. He ran some of my first stories in, I think, 2013, in October.
Okay.
He ran some of the stories in the paper, and that brought more people. CBC, which is of course our national radio apparatus, they had me on the local version to talk
Oh,
about
cool.
my work.
Okay.
Yeah, so that really kind of helped knock
Yeah.
down some walls and make people a little more comfortable. Because again, this was 12 years ago now, but people were still pretty conservative about the paranormal.
Hmm.
And I mean, in some places they still are, but it's
For
it's
sure.
much bigger now than it was, and people are a lot more comfortable talking about this stuff. But you're talking about a working class town. People they knew me from the store. This guy used to sell them
Hmm.
their cigarettes. Now he wants to know if they've seen a headless person walk across their living room. Like, it takes some
Yeah.
adjustment.
No, but that's an interesting, like, kind of, I think, perspective is like, because I want to ask, like, how, if at all, how has the book, now that you've again done two iterations of the book, how has it been received by people in the town? Do they see it as something that is just like either positive or negative for the town, or just kind of like an interesting homage? Like, is it received well or not?
I think it was received well.
Yeah.
Think I don't want to say I don't think Revelstoke cared all that much because that's not fair.
Hmm.
Because I know there's a lot of people there who've contacted me and said they really do enjoy it, and
Right.
I'm
Right.
very grateful for all of them.
Hmm.
But I don't think it changed the town's like self-reflection one iota. I don't
Right.
think. That said, there is someone apparently. I think they're self-publishing a book, but they might be traditionally publishing it. But they're doing a book about kind of the larger region. So maybe
Okay.
maybe without Strange, maybe that wouldn't have been the case. I
Right.
don't know. But I don't think it's changed Revelstoke's sort of opinion of itself as a spooky place. Like
Hmm.
I launched a website called hauntedrevelstoke.com where
Oh,
it's
interesting.
basically
Okay.
like a
Yeah.
blog where people can send in their encounters. Because I thought it'd be a fun, like, because I'm not doing any more Revelstoke books after
Mm-hmm.
Strange, and really the only reason I did Strange 2.0 is because the first book, the first edition, went out of print.
Right.
So
Mm-hmm.
when it went out of print, Paul, my co-host on Ghost Story Guys, he suggested I approach Beyond the Fray about
Mm-hmm.
keeping it going. And so I did a big revamp. Obviously I added about 30
Mm-hmm.
pages. I took a bunch of crap out. Just kind of, actually, there's more commentary in the first book.
Oh, really? Oh, interesting.
Yeah,
Okay.
I prefaced a lot of the chapters with like a paragraph or two of commentary,
Mm-hmm.
but I took it all out for the second edition because I just wanted the
Mm-hmm.
stories to sort of stand on their own.
Right.
Because I also didn't think my commentary really added anything. I was kind of like, I don't know that I'm saying anything here that's like, I think to me at the time, it felt like, oh, I need to say this because this
Mm-hmm.
is like, you might not know this,
You want to, yeah, right.
but I feel like now, again, the stuff is so much more commonplace. I think
Mm-hmm.
it's not necessary. But yeah, so I've completely lost my point.
No, you're all good. No, like I was asking like how it's been received and everything.
Oh yeah,
It sounds like you've kind of like, even though like you say, you're not going to be doing another version or another Revelstoke specific book.
oh, Haunted
Um,
Revelstoke. That's it.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, Haunted Revelstoke. Yep.
Thank you. So the ADHD is real.
Right.
But yeah, so I set up the website because I thought, oh, this would be a great place for people can submit fresh stuff.
Yeah.
And this way, like I don't have to, again, I'm done writing those books, but the website will always be a place where new stories can kind of thrive. And I put it in the second book. I mentioned you can contact me there, send in stories,
Mm-hmm.
zero interest whatsoever.
Really?
None. I shouldn't say
Huh.
none because
But yeah.
the handful of stories that are on there are in Strange 2.0.
Mm-hmm.
So it's served its purpose there. But since then,
Oh,
zero,
that's interesting.
nothing. And I kind of have a theory about that.
What's your theory? Because I'm curious because I would like that's not what I was expecting you to say.
So this sounds crazy. And I understand, like you and I doing what we do, we're kind of used to
Yeah.
hearing this stuff. But
Yeah.
even so, I still feel a little wonky saying it. I think there is that whatever the thing is, the biggest thing in Revelstoke,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think it wants to stay off the radar. That's my thought. I think that whatever is there likes to operate in silence
Mm-hmm.
and on its own. Even honestly, like Revelstoke was a really cheap place to live, but it was a very angry place, very like say working class
Well, you said
place.
violent and violent. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
That's yeah.
And then when the ski hill came, I was really excited because I thought, oh, that's cool, So like a breath of
Mm-hmm.
fresh air and
Right.
the new voices on city council, some new people coming,
Mm-hmm.
some new a new arts community.
Yeah.
And there was a very brief period where it seemed like things were going in a really great place.
Mm-hmm.
But then Revelstoke was almost like an early harbinger of where the housing market was going
Oh,
because very
that's
quickly
yeah.
people made it very hard for new people to move there.
Mm-hmm.
And rent just spiraled out of control and
Mm-hmm.
has gone way out of control. I know it has everywhere, but
Right.
especially in a town where it's really hard to make a reasonable living.
Right. To begin with. Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Mm-hmm.
gone crazy. And again, I kind of think the fact that it happened there before it happened everywhere else, again, I think it was this subtle influence
Mm-hmm.
wanting it like, this is fine as it is.
Mm-hmm.
No,
Right.
this is fine as it is. Because if you go back in the paper, and I don't think I mentioned this in the book, but I found an article back when they opened Rogers Pass because,
Mm-hmm.
so the highway that connects Revelstoke to the rest of Canada goes through Rogers Pass, which is a particular mountain pass. But before
Mm-hmm.
they built that in 62, I think, before they opened it, you used to have to take like a 6-hour detour around, I think, the Selkirk
Yes.
Mountains or the Monashi Mountains.
Yeah. Yeah.
But what's fascinating is there was a newspaper article from when it opened, or sure, maybe 6 months after, that said, man, we don't have enough gas stations or hotels.
Right.
And they asked, why don't we? And city council basically said, well, we didn't think anything would change.
That you see that tells you a lot right there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I just feel like that malaise
Mm-hmm.
has kind of just kept going. So I think whatever,
Yeah.
I mean, malaise isn't fair because there's a lot of good stuff happening in Revelstoke, but
Right. But
just there is a very sense of like, no, we're not known for this thing. Whatever, ski hill, fine. There's a lot of like summer like hiking and biking and stuff, fine.
right.
But this stuff, no, this is
Mhm.
not us. And again, I
Right.
think there is like a subtle, there is something I think subtly kind of engineering that, which as
Right.
crazy as that sounds.
It kind of works both ways in some places because you look at other towns, especially here in Appalachia, where you get one weird sighting of one weird thing, and now you have a festival you know?
Yeah, yeah.
And people, like, whether they can quote unquote believe it or not, kind of like embrace it, as like oh, we're a weird place. Where, like, then you again read a book like A Strange Little Place about Revelstoke, and you're like, this place has that in spades. This may be a pessimistic view of mine, but it's like no one's even capitalizing on this weirdness. And there's an appetite for it other places. Why isn't there one there? And so that's why I think it's so interesting that
Yeah.
that you bring that up.
There were periods of time where you couldn't even get a copy of the book there.
Wow.
I mean, now I'm pretty sure there's a new
Yeah.
bookstore that's
Hmm.
selling them, but yeah, there was a long period where you couldn't get one at all. It
Hmm.
just wasn't it wasn't around. And frankly, if I still lived there, I'd be doing a walking ghost tour in the summer,
Right. Yeah.
or in the winter. I mean, there's more people there in the winter.
Right. Yeah.
I think there's money in it, and I've been told there used to be one,
Hmm.
but I couldn't find any record of it.
Oh.
And I was also
Okay.
told at one point there was someone writing a book like mine, but they died before they finished it. But again, I was never able to find out who,
Who?
and
Yeah.
so it's possible it's just smoke.
Right, because like again, we've been lucky enough to have different folks on this show. One person we talk about a lot is Thomas White, who's a local folklorist
Oh yeah,
down one of the universities here. He talks about how important it is to like keep stories going and why they keep going. And I think that it has a lot to do with people's interest in the history of an area, and not only interest in the past, but like an equal interest in the future. And that's why when you mentioned that, like, the stuff with that pass through the mountains and people saying like, oh, we didn't think things would change, it's like, okay, well, you're not proud about the past and you're not excited about the future, so like that really does kind of color people's present, you know.
oh dude. I mean, not to get too deep into my baggage, but like one of the things I've learned through
Mhm.
therapy as an adult is we were not taught to plan for a future.
Right, yeah,
We
yep.
were not taught that you could envision
Hmm.
something more than what you had. Like this was life,
Right,
and
right,
to not do life is like you're somehow screwing up.
right.
You know?
Hmm. No, and I think a lot of people that grow up in similar towns can absolutely
Yeah.
relate to that. um and so yeah, that's a very interesting situation, for the whole kind of town to be in. Now, I know we've done I think we're kind of painting this picture for everyone of what this place is like and the attitudes and everything are like, and kind of what you've kind of gone through to compile this book. This book has literally a little bit of everything in it, plus more. Like I said,
Yes.
there's a few stories in here where that even some other folks have called out are just like really bananas in the best way. But I want to start with kind of like the simplest version and kind of get some of your thoughts on this.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
You have a lot of stories in here about strange lights, and I'm not the first person to, like, obviously correlate strange lights with, kind of base level paranormal stuff. It seems like if there's literally anything else, there's probably also strange lights in an area. So I think that's like a good place to kind of start. And there's a ton of strange light stuff in here. Do you have like a particular strange light story that either kind of sticks out for you as particularly poignant, or just like really surprised you?
Yeah, I mean, there's probably two. Like the first would be my own, the
Oh,
the
yeah,
the
there we
the,
go. Yep.
the green light. So
Mm-hmm.
the short version of that is like obviously I was, I don't know, young teenager, maybe thereabouts. But it was New Year's. My friend and I were out. I was a really boring teenager, so we were just drinking a lot of discount soda and playing video games.
Yeah.
And it was snow and so heavy, like big, heavy, wet flakes. And we thought, again, we're all jacked up on sugar. About 3 in the morning, we just go shovel. Let's go shovel. We
I
can
love
shovel
that.
the
Yeah.
driveway.
I can relate. Yeah.
And yeah, and I don't know if you've seen this, but there is this really beautiful phenomenon that used to happen in Revelstoke when I was a kid, where when the snow's fresh,
Mm-hmm.
there's so much reflection of the streetlights, it seems much brighter than it actually is.
Right, for sure. Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
and so
Mm-hmm.
it was this really beautiful night. We were shoveling; it was wet and slushy, and it was really just it was gorgeous.
Yeah.
And then by the time we got out to actually shovel, it had stopped snowing, and the sky was clear.
Mm-hmm.
And we both saw, both me and my friend, I saw it from one direction. I later found out when I interviewed him, he saw it from a completely different direction. This green light, and it
Mm-hmm.
flashed. But when I say flashed, it wasn't like we were. someone was shining a green light on us, it was like all the air around us was green.
Right, which is a distinction I think that's important.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It was like we're in green water, but there's no water. It's just air, And it was. I remember looking at my hand and thinking, "What is
Hmm.
going on?"
Right.
And then it was over,
Hmm.
and we just kind of went inside, and we didn't really talk about it. And so that was kind of my like the probably the thing that wedged in my head,
Hmm.
kind of became the stone in my shoe, so to speak, of this stuff in Revelstoke.
Yeah.
And after Strange came out, I was contacted by an old classmate of mine. Actually, shortly before I started working on two, he had seen a similar thing, but on a different day.
Oh,
Uh,
really? Okay.
yeah,
Interesting.
as the sun was setting. So ours was in the dead of night. His was still during the
Hmm.
daytime, but still this green flash,
Hmm.
and it just everywhere. And like I said, he was the only one who saw it. But it scared the heck out of him.
Right. Like that stuff I think is so interesting because when it happens, like you said, you're just like almost like not confused, but you're just like what's going on? It's not like scary when it's happening, but it is like you're like, oh, this is different. This is unique. This is strange. And whether or not it has a like regardless of what the source of something like that is, it affected you and your friend, and it was like a really important experience, it sounds like.
Oh yeah, yeah. Again,
Hmm.
we didn't talk about it much, but it just you can't help but be aware that it had happened. And in the back of your
Hmm.
mind, there's always a question, what was that?
Right. Well, and I think that like that, like I like the analogy of a stone in your shoe. I think a lot of times that's how this stuff starts for people and everything, and then that stuff starts. I mean, there are some people who have tons of paranormal experiences, especially early on in their life, and that definitely shapes people. But for a lot of myself and people like myself included, you just have a few little weird things happen that just like stick with you and kind of gnaw at you a little bit and make you want to learn more. Now, as far as your experience with the paranormal, like the rest of your time in Revelstoke, like you mentioned, the grocery store that you lived above,
Oh yeah, yeah.
there was obviously some like weird stuff that happened there. Was there? Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Because I think that's something people can relate to a lot too. Because I think a lot of people when they're out on their own for the first time, living somewhere, really anywhere new, you have weird things that happen that you start going with like, oh, this is just my brain playing tricks on me, or it's just me getting used to the place. And after a while, you're like, nah, something's up. There's something going on here.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you want to give a high level of some of those stories and that experience? Because
Yeah.
you're relatively young at that time, right? In your early 20s.
Oh yeah, yeah. I moved out of the
Yeah.
house when I was 19.
Okay, perfect. Okay,
So
yeah.
yeah, I just moved into this apartment. It was, I say, it was above the store that we ran. My mother was part owner with another fella, and yeah, it was a big apartment. It originally had been two different apartments. They knocked it all, not them, but the previous owners had knocked it
Hmm.
all together into one. It was dirt, for the time it was reasonable
Yeah.
price. And yeah, obviously it was expensive to heat because it was oil heat back then. But
Right.
yeah, it was a gorgeous place. And when I moved in, there were two bathrooms, two full bathrooms, and there was one, two, three. Like technically, I guess what you could say is four bedrooms plus a living room,
Hmm.
if you wanted to. But there was one room at the top of the stairs because I eventually, again, I was 19. I worked all the time and I didn't party. So I had, a lot of money saved back to when I could save money. What a time.
Right.
Um, so I bought like a nice big TV and I bought, my friend of mine had a foosball table. So we put a foosball table in one of the rooms and put my computer in the other room and
Yeah.
the bedroom. And there was one room, the one room right at the top of the stairs. We could never get it to be anything.
Hmm.
I tried making it like a little library, didn't take. It just became the place people would pass out after parties. Like it
Right.
just nothing took in there.
Hmm.
And I didn't think much of it. I just didn't spend any time in there. I was there for a little bit and I obviously lived first time living on my own, so I was stoked. I would fall asleep, with all the doors open and Rammstein playing in the living room,
Yeah.
'cause I bought big speakers because of course I did.
Right. Right.
And over time, I became really uncomfortable sleeping with my bedroom door open.
Hmm.
I don't know why. I just became so I started closing
Right.
it before I went to bed, and then I started locking it,
Mm.
and then
Mm.
I became uncomfortable with the music playing in the next room, and I was like, "Well, that's weird," but I didn't think too much of
Yeah.
it. And then one night I was laying in bed after a particularly busy day at work, and I remember, how sometimes I don't know if you get this, but sometimes at the end of a day, if I've had a lot of like ambient noise, I can kind of still hear it in my head.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So I was laying there, I was listening, I was just trying to chill out in bed, hearing the ambient noise. But then I realized the ambient noise was no longer just in my head. I was hearing, like physically hearing it.
Hmm.
I was hearing what sounded like people
Right.
talking. I was hearing what sounded like glasses clinking and plates clinking. And I grew up right across from a rail yard. You know, that my other place, that place was not far from the rail yard, or from the
Mm-hmm.
tracks at least. So I thought, okay, it must be a freight train going by.
So, yeah.
Yeah. But then I started hearing voices,
Mm,
and I started hearing like cutlery on the plate,
right.
you know, and it sounded like someone was having a dinner party in my kitchen.
Yeah. Which
And
is,
yeah, not awesome.
yeah, not cool.
No.
That's not cool.
So I very bravely closed my eyes and just tried to
Hmm.
will myself to sleep, and didn't think about it. But then, I went and got a girlfriend, and she started staying over more and more.
Hmm.
Because I was very young and stupid, she needed a place to stay, so I invited her to move in way too early. Don't do
Yeah.
that, kids.
Yeah.
Live on your own as long as you can. But yeah, and then she went through the same progression. Oh, I can't
Oh,
believe I have this
really?
huge. Yeah, I can't
Okay.
believe
So,
I have this.
so she didn't like it wouldn't be like at first hearing the voices and the cutlery, like disembodied audio you're hearing. Were there instances early on where you would be hearing that and she wouldn't be hearing it at the same time,
So
or was it all individual?
I only ever had heard the audio the once.
Oh, okay. Okay.
But it was the same progression of, oh, look at all this space. And
Hmm.
then I feel like I'm not the only, like, I'm not alone
Oh, the
here.
whole, okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
And like she would shower with the bathroom door open, and then she
Hmm.
started showering with the bathroom door closed.
Hmm.
And she would come and hang out downstairs with me when I was working,
Hmm.
because she just didn't, not all the time,
Feel,
but there were
yeah.
times where she didn't feel totally comfortable up there. She didn't
Hmm.
feel alone.
Right.
Eventually, we split up. She moved out, and I was at Denny's one night, and
Yep.
it was late, and this woman came over to me, and she said, "Hey," and I knew her from around, and she said, "Hey, you live above Bocce's, right?" I said, "Oh, yeah, 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 yeah." She goes, "Oh, you notice anything weird up there?"
Oh,
I said, "What do you mean?" She's like, "Well, and she described the same progression of
yeah.
emotions I'd had, except she was up there with a roommate. That roommate had a daughter,
Oh.
and that daughter would play with another little kid who wasn't there in the room at the top of the stairs,
Mm,
the room that I couldn't get to be anything. And
that's
uh
worse.
right, yeah. So eventually I moved out. I bought a house, and I moved, because again, you could do back then.
Right. At the time, yeah.
Um yeah, I think the most it was ever worth was like 80 grand. But yeah, so I moved into a house, and my boss, who owned the apartment, he had a heck of a time filling. He had some folks up there. They weren't very nice to the place. He booted them out.
Hmm.
And I was in the back one time. I was doing the books after my shift,
Okay.
and
Yeah.
I heard music, like bass. It sounded like bass. So I thought it
Hmm.
was my neighbor's kids having a party, because I knew the neighbors were in Mexico. And then I thought, no, 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 the neighbors took the kids with them to Mexico this time. And
Hmm.
that's when I realized, no, that's coming from upstairs. Now, it was supposed to be empty.
Right.
So, but yeah, so it was supposed to be empty. So I thought, okay, I knew he's been showing it. Maybe he forgot to lock it. We didn't have a lot of homeless people back then, but we had a few.
Right. Right.
Not impossible. Someone got in there,
Hmm.
started goofing around. There was a door that separated the back of the store from the bottom of the stairs to the apartment. So I
Hmm.
cranked it open. I thought, well, I'll just take a quick look. But the door was locked. The door that led outside was locked. So I thought, oh, that's weird. Okay, well, seems odd, but
Yeah.
fine. But then I heard the thumping get
Oh.
closer. And the way the stairs worked is they went up in front of you, and then they went off to the right.
Hmm.
So the second flight was out of sight. And the thumping got closer, and eventually I heard footsteps on the top step. And I slammed that door real hard, locked it, and went home. Um, and
Fair response.
yeah, yeah. And we had other things happen. Like, again, there was a real turn in that
Hmm.
building. Eventually, we were robbed at gunpoint. My mom was working. My sister was there. The store was, yeah, one evening we were robbed.
Wow.
And that really kind of marked the beginning of the end for
Right.
us, when we kind of wanted
Hmm.
to get out.
It's fair.
Because it was never like a super profitable thing. It did okay, but,
Hmm.
we all one of us had to be there all the time.
Right. Which is taxing. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And my mother started noticing she would sometimes see what looked like a man standing in a corner by the ice cream sandwiches, by like where the ice cream coolers were, and just not all the time,
Mm-hmm.
but sometimes. And other people mentioned it as well. Some of the other girls who worked there mentioned it as well. And then after I moved out, again back at Jenny's,
Mm-hmm.
this time one of the waitresses comes over and says, "Hey man, you used to live above Bocce's, right?" Yeah, yeah. She's like, "Oh,
Mm-hmm.
I live there now." She said, "You ever notice anything weird up there?"
Yeah. Here we
And
go.
there was another night years later after I'd moved out of Victoria, or moved to Victoria, when I'd come back,
Mm-hmm.
and I was just walking and I was looking at the store, and we had a lot of good times there. Like, well, we
Yeah,
sold
right.
it. We like to say we started about 10 years too early. Like the kind of
Mm,
cosmopolitan stuff we
yeah.
were selling, because we were like an import place,
Mm-hmm.
and the appetite for that kind of stuff, again, those people moved in about 10 years later, about 5 to 10
Right.
years
Just
later.
wasn't there at the time.
Wasn't there
Yeah.
at the time.
Yeah.
So like we sold a lot of convenience store stuff, but the cooler stuff, again, we did okay, but it just didn't
Mm-hmm.
have the market it could have. But we had a lot of good times there.
Right.
I still back on that very fondly.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was standing there looking at the store. By this point, the person we'd sold it to had screwed it up and it had closed. And it was perpetually under construction for quite a while. And I
Mm-hmm.
was standing there looking at the store when all of a sudden I noticed there was a flash of blue light in one of the darkened windows of the apartment. And I thought, well, that's weird. Someone's
Mm-hmm.
taking pictures in a darkened apartment.
Right.
And then as I stood there, that flash happened again, but in every single window of the apartment at the same time. And
Weird.
yeah,
That's
and
weird.
I took off
Yeah.
and I was out of there. So when I started working on Strange, I finally
Mm-hmm.
went to go. I talked because by that point it had opened into a yoga studio and a tea bar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so I went to go talk to the woman who ran the place, a woman named Diane. And she had put so much love into that building, man. She invested a lot of money into it. It just felt like a much happier place.
Mm-hmm.
I think the
Right.
building really needed love, and I think it was not happy that
Right.
we had, because we couldn't really afford to put a lot of money into it.
Right. Right. Right.
And upstairs, she had knocked out every single wall and completely redistributed all the apartments, or
Mm-hmm.
all the rooms. But there was still one room she could not get to be anything. A
Mm.
room into which she put a brand new marble countertop and came
Yeah.
back the next morning to find it cracked clean down the center.
Really?
Yeah. And it was right next to this. It was that room at the top of the
That
stairs.
room. Yeah. That's
Yeah.
wild.
Yeah.
And like, it's crazy because like when you first start with that story, it almost sounds like your stereotypical like residual haunting. It's like, oh, this is obviously just like leftover energy from other good times or, whatever. But then like you get to the footsteps on the stairs and you get to the bad vibes in one room, a gentleman standing next to the ice cream bars just being creepy, it sounds like.
Yeah.
And then you get to actual destruction of granite countertops, which one, not cheap, and
Yep.
like two, like is some pretty serious, like that's not just like moving a glass on a table. That's
Yeah.
that's pretty legitimate on by any level. So it's obviously like something is off here, despite, so you said this lady trying to really change the vibe of the place.
And I think it did help.
It
I mean,
did.
it felt a
Yeah.
lot nicer. And what was interesting
Mhm.
too is she said she put in the tea bar because it was
Mhm.
originally intended to just be a wellness studio. She put in
Yeah.
the tea bar because she said, I feel like there is something here that demands there be some kind of like mercantile aspect to it.
Mm.
She's like, I feel like I have to sell something.
So, yeah.
Because prior to us taking it over, it had been closed for about, I want to say about 5, 6 years, but
That's a while. Okay.
my
Yeah.
entire life, it was a grocery store.
Okay. And
Like
there
it was,
so
it was for decades and decades. It was a
Mhm.
grocery store. It was a guy named Moose Ali Khan ran it for a long time,
Mhm.
and then Vince Sessa ran it. So just all of these people, like decades again of
Mhm.
being a store, and so she really felt like whatever was there, this was one of its
Had
demands.
That's wild. That's another just like interesting arc that like doesn't follow the traditional path. That's a wild one, especially for you to experience that like not only at a young age, but then have it be revisited so much throughout your life through all those other conversations and people bringing it up, like not even when you're researching the book, just through
Oh yeah, this was
conversation.
all well before that. I mean,
Like,
again, I was an atheist. Like I
yeah.
was raised in the Catholic Church.
Hmm.
My grandmother was kind of a jerk about it, so
Hmm.
I grew up really resenting religion generally.
Right.
And by the time I started working on the book, I was at the point, despite having had those experiences,
Hmm.
I was at the point where I'm just like, nah, It's not for
No,
me.
this is, yeah.
I think it's all fake. I think it's right. I
Mhm.
think when you die, you die. You meet in the ground. People, still
Yeah.
I had those experiences. I think a lot of them I just kind of filed away.
I think that's what happens to a lot of folks, especially when they deal with stuff that they are able to compartmentalize. You can understand why a normal, rational, sane person would have an experience. Because you hear about this all the time where someone has an experience and they go, nope. And they just keep on going with their life like nothing ever
Yeah.
happened. And I don't know if that's a bit of like a defense mechanism or some kind of primal response, that our brain
Oh,
is
I
just
think you're
like,
right.
we're not going to interface with that. It's not almost like you said, that's not for us. That's not what we do here,
Yeah. Yeah.
on an internal scale. But now in that same light, I think that there's also a few stories in here in your book that have like a positive spin to them, and they definitely affected people in a positive way. One of the ones that one of my buddies who started reading this book asked about was the angel sighting that a gentleman named Harold had. Do you remember that one off the top of your head? Where
Oh, yeah.
he became religious afterwards, and that stayed with him through his whole life.
Yeah. Oh, no, happily. So that, yeah, actually, I can say his name now because both him and his wife, unfortunately, have passed.
Okay, yeah.
Harold Howery was his name.
Hmm.
And he wasn't actually a Revelstoke resident. I found his story, or the first part of his story,
Hmm.
in a John Keel book.
Oh, really? Oh, see, I missed that too. Okay,
Yeah, I think it's in
okay.
Our Haunted Earth.
Haunted Earth. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it's in there.
I
He
have that
mentioned,
back here somewhere.
okay, yeah. So
Yeah.
he mentions Revelstoke, and imagine my surprise.
Right. Yeah.
He mentions a guy named Harold Howery had this
Hmm.
experience driving just outside of town where this cloud
Hmm.
bigger than his car descended above the car and followed them. And his wife saw it too.
Hmm.
And so I tracked down Frida Howery, his wife,
Hmm.
and because Harold was passed.
Hmm.
And so I managed to track down Frida in the Okanagan, which is a region of southern British Columbia. And so she told me her side of that story, which is in the book. But
Hmm.
she said that for Harold, this was actually not the first time he'd had something like that because he'd had this experience with the angel. And yeah,
Hmm.
he grew up in rural Alberta and he saw this out, kind of just playing out in the dirt as you did back then.
Hmm.
He saw, yeah, an angel appeared to him, and
Wow.
he, he that changed the course of his life entirely.
Hmm.
He became religious instantly,
Right.
and according to Frida, it really made military service more bearable for him because he would pray every night, and
Hmm.
the soldiers who were also, who were also of that faith, they would find him
Hmm.
and he kind of made connections with them. But so for him, it wasn't exactly a shock.
Hmm.
And it really did, kind of improve, you would say, the quality of his life and kind of gave him a
Hmm.
framework that he didn't
Right.
freak out about it when he saw it. She's not sure how he found John Keel. Um,
That's interesting in itself. Like,
yeah, yeah. She has no idea how she found him. I don't even think she realized her story was out there like that.
mm. Oh,
Um,
really? Oh, wow. Okay.
yeah, because like my finding her was, she was very surprised.
Hmm.
We had a lovely afternoon together, one summer day in Lake Country, BC.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's again the story she told me. But it was a positive thing, and I think it's important to remember that, right? Like I think because
Hmm.
this, it's an industry, right? What you and I do,
Right.
this is like for me, I make my living with the paranormal, and
Hmm.
because that sells, right? It's
Hmm.
spooky, scary.
Right. Right. Right.
Like I don't like saying demons. I'd rather, I'd take gunpoint for me to say that, but like that sells.
Hmm.
And so we kind of fixate on that, but there are some really cool stories
Right.
where these things had a positive impact. Like the one in the book, the woman who heard the voices on the speakers.
Yes.
She was going through a real rough patch in her
Hmm.
life. And actually she just passed on herself here recently, so I could say her name. Her name was Barb Johnson. And yeah, she was going through a real bad patch in her life, and she heard what
Hmm.
sounded like two people talking over like a CB radio or something that was
Right.
coming through these computer speakers that weren't plugged in. And
Right.
they said something to the effect of like, "Oh, it looks like rough road ahead, but for the next little while, but I think it's gonna be okay." And
Right.
that, I mean, even if that
Yeah.
was just a stray radio signal,
Right.
it made
Absolutely.
her feel better.
Right. Absolutely. And that's why I think that, like you said, doing what we do, talking about these stories and everything, it's important to I think just look at how these things affect people, both good, bad, and indifferent, and not to because again, me and Nick get caught up a lot in the mechanism of what's quote unquote really going on here, or
Sure.
how like what does this mean? Where's it coming from? And like that whole element, which is fun, but really at the end of the day, if someone has something happen and it affects their life in a positive way, that's a great thing in
Yeah.
itself. It doesn't like we can talk about it, but it doesn't need to be it doesn't need to be debunked at that point. Like if
No,
that
that's it.
person, yeah, like that was just a good thing that happened to that person.
When someone would come to me and say, because there are some stories that aren't in the book because they
Hmm.
deal with relatively well-known deaths of people in
Okay,
town, and
yeah,
I just thought no one needs this.
right,
Um,
exactly.
but there was some that were positive. They're like,
Hmm.
oh, this person's gone, and I feel okay about that now. Like I
Hmm.
feel, and I've had those experiences in dreams.
Right,
Like
absolutely.
when
Yep.
my maternal grandmother passed, she was babysitting us, and then she went home one
Hmm.
day and she just didn't come back.
Right.
And it was, I want to say, months after. I would
Hmm.
dream of her. I would dream of hearing her voice upstairs,
Hmm.
and I would run up to meet her, and she wouldn't be there. And then finally one day she was, and
Yeah.
she gave me a hug and she said goodbye. And
Wow.
every now and again I'll dream of her, but she's always in the
Hmm.
background. She'll see me and she'll see me notice her and she'll wave.
Hmm.
And are those dreams? Are those visitations? I don't know. But I
I don't
mean,
know.
if someone told me that story, I would never say, "Well, that's just a dream," because
Right.
what does that
Right.
serve?
Right.
Like
Exactly.
that doesn't help anyone.
Yeah.
And like when people write into the ghost story guys, and they'll say
Hmm.
like, "Do you think this is a dream or a visitation?" I'm like, well, did it
What do
help?
you think? Yeah.
Did it help you? Then
Yeah.
that's all that matters. Like
Right.
yeah, nothing else matters. I mean, again, if
Right.
you're like, well, I saw a vision and the guy said, "You should give me $10,000," like that's a different animal. But like,
Right.
if it just improves the quality of your life, I'm not going to mess with that. I'm not like I used to listen to a lot of atheist comedy podcasts,
Hmm.
really up until earlier this year, and like the thing that used to bug me about them, which hey, I guess I should have figured this was coming. It's an atheist podcast, but like they couldn't leave room for that, and I have an issue with that
Hmm.
because if it doesn't affect you, if it's not hurting anyone, doesn't matter.
No, exactly. And that's why, like, I think that when it comes to like the role of gathering these stories, that's again kind of why I like your, I don't want to say lack of commentary, but you're just kind of simple framing of these stories to let them kind of sit on their own. Again, these are important events, and we've talked about some of the positive ones, some of the ones that were certainly negative, but there's a lot of other stuff that happens like almost like in the middle, which is just like falls into that kind of that, like high strangeness category.
Sure.
Um, and we mentioned John Keel earlier, which I'm a huge fan of, obviously. Do you have what's a story from this book? Because I have one I want to ask. I'm just going to lead with that because
Yeah, yeah,
this is
please
what I
do.
mentioned earlier. So the men with the clipboards.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Sure, yeah. So, mostly this is like most of this actually happens outside of or outside of Revelstoke. But
Hmm.
I once, after I'd moved, I had a dream about being in Revelstoke, with two friends, and we were
Yeah.
walking. It was nighttime. We were walking down to this grocery store. My friend wanted to get a soda. He went in to get soda. My other friend and I were waiting outside, and I looked down this one street. I think it's Downey Street, and it
Hmm.
runs behind my old elementary school. And I
Yeah.
noticed as I stood there that the street was empty, but when the wind blew, there was a little bit of a breeze, and when it did, the street rippled. I thought
Hmm.
that's not normal. So I walked up closer, and I realized that there were like curtain panels hung
Hmm.
across the road, and down the seams of the panels was a strange silvery writing.
Yes.
And I parted the panels, and behind it was the same street, but it was lit up like a movie set. Like I've since
Hmm.
been on, or I've seen movie sets since then, and I've realized like that's what that looked
That's what it
like.
looks like. Yeah.
So many lights,
Hmm.
cables everywhere, machines, and there were these man-sized insect things
Hmm.
working the machines. They were
Hmm.
chittering to each other, and they were like going back and forth. They kind of looked like praying mantises almost.
Right.
And they
Yeah.
were going back and forth and looking at stuff and playing with stuff. And then finally, one of them saw me looking at
Hmm.
them, and he made this like kind of a noise, like an alert noise.
Hmm.
And I blinked, and all of a sudden, I was looking at dudes with holding clipboards, wearing like Carhartt work gear.
Yeah. Yeah. Just mundane. Yeah.
Yeah, and I woke up, and again, I was like, "All right, that's a weird dream." Wrote it
Hmm.
down. I try to keep a dream journal.
Right.
Didn't think too much of it, but one day when I was back in Victoria, I there's a dude I go for coffee with maybe once or twice a year.
Hmm.
And this particular time, I drove out to his house. We had a coffee, and then I stuck around. I usually don't stick around. And I just had this weird feeling that I should ask him something. And this was January, or this was in 2017. This happened because it was the
Okay, so yeah.
first year of Strange, or first
Hmm.
year of Ghost Story Guys.
Okay, yeah, yeah.
And I asked him, I said, you ever anything weird happen lately? Because we sort of became friends
Have
when
that repertoire, yeah.
yeah, we both happened to be in Portland
Hmm.
at the same time for separate reasons. And in that totally unfamiliar surroundings, him and his wife, they just like unburdened themselves and told me about all this paranormal stuff that happened over the course of their
Oh,
lives.
that's so cool.
Yeah, and it just connected us, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so,
As it does,
anyways,
yeah.
yeah. And so I asked him, and he said, "No, not really." But he said, "Funny." He said, "I was thinking about this recently," and he told me that when he was a kid, he grew up in Victoria. They lived on a farm in a place called
Hmm.
Saanich, which is like a rural community just outside the city. He remembers living in a house that backed onto a marsh, and he would see men with clipboards and boiler suits,
Hmm.
like coveralls,
Yeah.
walking around their yard. And he would see them parachuting in, and he just thought they were government guys. Again, he was like
Hmm.
5, 6, 7 years old, and they would sometimes just stand at the windows looking at the family. And
Hmm.
they would write things on their clipboards, and they always seemed to be working on something.
Right.
And then one day he asked his mom, he said, "Why are those men out there all the time?" And she said, "What men?"
Ugh.
"The men." And she had no idea what he's talking about, and he never saw them again.
Yeah.
So that was interesting. But then I also happened to be having a conversation with Peter Kursov, who makes our music, or pardon me, I should say, who composed the theme song for Ghost Story Guys.
Hmm.
And he lives in Moscow. And we were talking about this, and I said, "You ever hear about something like this?" And because I had found a story. I had found a story online
Oh, okay.
somewhere where a
Yeah.
woman in Moscow near this one train station, I think it was the Tetralnaya station, she saw these men
Hmm.
working on something. And she said, like, they looked like they were government people or something because they were working
Hmm.
on electrical things, but
Hmm.
she didn't know who they belonged to. And Peter
Right.
said, he said, that's not uncommon. He said that there are stories in Russia. There was a train that vanished. There's this
Hmm.
urban legend about a subway train that vanished. And he said that sometimes people will say you can see a train come in and it's full of these guys, but no one knows who they are, who they work for. And I found a handful of other stories
Yeah.
online. And so we again, episode 16 of the show, in the first version of the show, it's called "The Men Who Are Not There," and
Oh, okay.
that's what that episode is about. It's a number of stories where people have seen these men in boiler suits in or coveralls doing like in places that don't make sense, and that kind
Hmm.
of doing things that don't really make sense. But do you ever watch the
Right.
movie The Adjustment Bureau?
Yeah.
It's a
So
little bit,
almost like, yeah.
yeah, like guys behind the scenes. There was actually even one story of this. He was really young, but he looked out the door and he saw, and it looked like they were moving furniture for a play, but they were moving like trees. It's bonkers. It's bonkers. But
Yeah.
without that
Yeah.
dream, I would never have thought to even
Never
ask
have
the
gone
question.
down that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of like, again, when we say high strangeness, it's just like this stuff that just like one thing leads to another, leads to another. It's a rabbit hole you didn't know you were going to be going down, you
Yeah,
know?
and I should mention too, this all happened before I'd read any Keel, and yet in
Hmm.
Keel there are mentions of silvery script that looks vaguely Asian, but
Hmm.
does not correspond to any known language. And I found that out after I'd had the dream, so this was not like I came into it preloaded.
Right. Right. It wasn't like it was like a buried memory or
Yeah, yeah.
something like that. Like, what the heck is that about? Like, like, what are you guys all like tapping into or seeing or, and I think that like one of the things about that like, I don't know, I like, and I know Nick really likes, is just that like, it's this idea that like, there's just more strange stuff going on than what we normally are able to pay attention to. And sometimes when we're in those, either a dream state or something like that, you get glimpses of it sometimes. And regardless of necessarily where it comes from, it's still interesting and worth, talking about.
Oh yeah.
Um,
There was a time I was in bed with my wife and she was already asleep.
mhm,
I got into bed and I rolled over, put my arm around her, and I was doing that thing where you have a conversation with yourself in your head,
mhm.
and but it was like me and a third party voice. So like
Oh,
not like I'm
yeah.
actually hearing a voice, but like
Mhm.
it's just like
Right.
a sort of
Yeah.
a stand-in interviewer kind of going through these thoughts in your head.
Mhm.
And this person asked my wife a question and she answered out loud.
See, it's just like,
She was asleep, but she
yeah.
agreed. This woman's like, and and you're cool with that? And Nick just kind of went, yeah,
Yeah.
but she was asleep.
That's nuts.
Yeah. And there
That's
was another one real quick. I know we're kind of getting
yeah.
close to the
Oh no,
wire,
we're
but
good. We're good. Yeah.
there was a time where, again, I had a dream where we were lying in bed and I heard a noise in the hallway, and
Mm-hmm.
I was like, oh, that's not good. It sounds like there's someone in the apartment. So in the dream, I got up and I turned on the bedside lamp, and I thought, oh, it's just a cat. And then I heard the
Yeah.
cat in another room, so I realized, no, that's not the
Mm-hmm.
cat. And then I heard this horrible, horrible laughter, like a witch, like
Mm-hmm.
an old crone laughter. And I charged because I'm
Yeah.
dumb, and so I just charged towards it, and it woke
Yeah.
up. But that day, Nick ended up in the
Mm-hmm.
hospital with her first kidney stone.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
So
And
that's yeah.
yeah, who's to say, right? Could be a total
Right. Yeah.
coincidence, but like
Something's going on.
something's up. And
Yeah,
there was
exactly.
another
Yeah.
time, again, lying in bed, and I heard two young girls in our living room talking to each other. They were
Ugh.
looking at the movies on my shelf, and they were discussing the
Mm-hmm.
movies on my shelf. Like, oh, I don't know that one, or I think I know that one.
Wow,
And
that's weird.
again, I was not
Yeah.
asleep. I
Mm-hmm.
was getting there, but I wasn't all the way asleep,
Right.
and no explanation whatsoever.
That's so wild. When it comes to like audio stuff like that, that's stuff that creeps because I've had a few weird audio things happen
Oh
myself
yeah,
that just because it seems so sentient, I guess.
yeah,
Where you're like, if I was gonna like what I say to myself is like if I was gonna make something up or try and project something, like why is that it? So it seems like
yeah.
it seems like it is exterior. And what some of that stuff kind of reminds me of is just again, like I said earlier, the idea that there is a source, like you talked about, or there's a mechanism, there's things going on. One of the things I wanted to ask about that I thought was a really fun story in this book, and one of our listeners who was also reading this brought up too, and we were kind of geeking out about it, is the story about the gremlins.
Oh yeah, yeah.
If you don't mind, can you give a brief overview of that story? Then I want to tell you what me and my friend were talking about and get your thoughts on it.
Sure, yeah. So, the gist of it, as I recall, is this couple had been going to visit the husband's birth mother, who they'd been put back in
Mm-hmm.
contact with, and she had a lot of electrical issues in her house, and she would always
Mm-hmm.
say, "Oh, it's just that's my gremlins," and they thought it was just kind of a colloquialism she used.
Mm-hmm.
But then she died, and they went
Mm-hmm.
back and they kind of straightened up her affairs and all those things.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the way home, they started having problems with the car. And the husband joked, "Oh, I guess we got mom's gremlins." But they started having electrical problems in their
Mm-hmm.
house, exactly the same way she had. And this woman, I guess, was talking to an Irish woman. The wife was talking to an Irish woman she
Mm-hmm.
knows. And she was describing what was going on. And this Irish woman said, "Oh, you got gremlins." Like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that's what you got.
Yeah.
You got gremlins. And she, of course, thought, what? And this woman was not like a stranger to the paranormal. I think in the book I
Right.
might have said she was, because I had to obscure details
Oh, for
because
sure.
I didn't have releases for some people.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
she wasn't a total newbie with paranormal, but even she was kind of like, what? And the Irish woman said, yeah, you need to put on an offering. She said, just put some milk in a dish, leave it outside your door, leave it there for a few days. They'll stop. That's fine.
Mm-hmm.
And so this woman, she was like, well, I don't know, man. I mean, I guess if
Yeah.
nothing else, I'll be real popular with the neighborhood cats for a couple days. So she put the milk in the
Right.
dish, she put it outside, and they live in a fairly rural area.
Mm-hmm.
There's raccoons, there's I think there might be coyotes,
Mm-hmm.
uh,
Yeah, probably.
dogs,
Yeah.
neighborhood dogs, cats,
Mm-hmm.
Nothing touched that dish. Nothing touched it, and the electrical interference stopped.
It's nuts because people like the storyteller kind of says is you think like, oh, this is just like a folksy colloquialism, it's just
Yeah,
like, oh, that's just a fun way to frame poor luck with
totally.
electronics,
Yeah.
but when it comes to that stuff, whenever in that book when you mentioned like the saucer and milk and everything, something that we do here at my house is we do tea that we leave out
Oh, yeah.
for that exact same reason. And I've gotten a few other friends, like this one who I was talking to included, when they moved into a new house, they were having a lot of like weird little problems, like things would go missing. It was kind of like this your stereotypical kind of like tricksterous poltergeist
Yep.
kind of stuff. And they're very ritualistic in their bedtime routines and everything. And I was like, well, when you're getting up in the morning, just when you're making your tea, just make an extra cup of tea like we do and just leave it there. that really helped them. So the fact that this lady was so quick to be like, oh, just leave out milk. I think when hearing stuff like that, it shows, like, again, how regardless of where this phenomena is happening, there is more similar than dissimilar across
Oh yeah.
cultures and across mountain ranges, countries, and we're all talking about the same stuff here,
Yeah.
one way or another.
I
Different
mean,
names for it, and it shows up different ways, but it's probably, more similar than not.
we just recorded an episode of Ghost Story Guys. It'll be out Tuesday. It's going to be called
Okay.
oh, I forget the no. Don't Go Haunting Waterfalls. It's an episode centered around waterfall
Nice.
stories.
Yeah.
But there is a story in there from the Philippines of a wailing thing
Oh, jeez. Yeah.
that seemed to be held at bay by these totems. And
Oh.
a couple episodes before that, we did High Strangeness in Italy, and there was a wailing creature there. And of course, we were lucky enough on the most recent episode to have Sinead Hanna from the Poisoner's Cabinet on as a guest
Okay.
storyteller. And
Mhm.
she's from Northern Ireland, or her parents are from Northern Ireland,
Mhm.
and so obviously we talk about the Banshee, but she said, I think like there's so much more than just the name, right? She
Right.
said like the Banshee culturally comes from keening women. It was
Yeah.
it was a thing.
Mhm.
But obviously there's things out there that also wail, and so they just kind of get called banshees. And so we tend to think like, well, that's an Irish thing, like wailing ghosts
Mhm.
or whatever, wailing whatever
Mhm.
they are an
Right.
Irish thing, but they're not. It's just that's most closely tied to it.
Wow.
And that's one of the things I love about kind of being in this field now, man, is like
Yeah.
you get to kind of break down some of the stuff. Because
Mhm.
I think when we strip things back to the studs and we're
Yeah.
just like, it's just this, the world is what we see, touch,
Right.
the end, game over. I think you lose a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
I think you kind of throw a lot of babies out with the bathwater.
Mhm.
Whereas if you kind of, okay, well, we don't have to call it like, I mean, Gremlins is a great term, but
Right.
like,
Exactly. Yeah. It's fun. Yeah.
but
But
we don't have to think like, oh, this is actually like a little tiny wee bugger, but that's it.
right.
But I think there is something there.
Mhm.
There's clearly something there. Like when when they demolished the building across the street from where Nick and I live in Victoria,
Mhm.
for about 3 weeks afterwards, we had these things, we called them the peekers, and they were just
Ooh.
little shadows about yay big, about 6 inches, 6 to 10 inches
Mhm.
big, and you'd see them just dart behind cover. And they weren't
Yeah.
like mice or rats, because we've seen
Right.
those. We sometimes get those. This was something else.
Yeah.
And eventually they went away, but it was almost like knocking that place down, just out they went,
Something.
and they had to find somewhere to go.
Mhm.
And
And
yeah,
ugh. And depending on your, like, cultural lens, is that a sprite? Is that a duende?
exactly.
Is that a brownie? Is that is it fae?
And that's when I think taxonomy works against us, because
Mhm.
you're debating nuance. You're like, well, but if it did do this, it's not a brownie, but it didn't
Right.
do this, so it's
Exactly.
not a
Yeah.
duende. And I think, yeah, that I mean, those things are useful, but I think
Yeah.
also they
They
can
serve a
prevent you.
purpose. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think they can also prevent you from grasping the phenomenon as a whole, because I think you're trying to put a lens over top of it when you need to examine it. And genuinely, man, I
Right.
think like my kind of line is that if there is a world, a life after this one,
Mhm.
I think it's going to be as inconceivable to us now as this one was to us in the womb.
Right.
It's like we can put as many stories on it as we want,
Mhm.
but I genuinely don't think we have the hardware to fully understand what it is.
Actually process it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And no, and that's again why, like, I love talking about the mechanism. Like, I love talking about the idea of, like, the role that water plays in
Yeah.
the movement of energy and, like, stuff. Like, I think that stuff's cool, but really I think that what these stories tell us about our culture and how they help us connect with our past and those around us, that's 99% of it. Like, that's what we should be spending our time talking about, like you said, is like not like the nuance between a whaling spirit in Italy versus a whaling spirit in Malaysia, but it's like, why do we both have whaling spirits?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
that's the important part, probably.
Yeah, I think if anything, if like there, if we sort of just take for granted there is like a subtle world out there,
Right.
I think that it has as many varied sort of
Mhm.
flora and fauna as this one does.
Right.
It's probably just as complex as
Mhm.
this, but it just in a way we can't see. And I think, like I think Dion Fortune used to say, the
Mhm.
paranormal in itself isn't dangerous. It's like the
Mhm.
ocean is or not bad. Like the ocean's not bad.
Right. Right.
And the ocean's not necessarily dangerous if you can respect it. But if you jump out of a boat in the middle of the ocean, bro, it's not going to go real bad for you.
It's gonna go bad for you. Yeah. Well, and that's, I mean, not to get like overly philosophical, but the idea of like like our taxonomy and our language adding morality to these things can get really complicated
Oh yeah.
for those exact reasons. Like you mentioned earlier, the word demon, and how some people will throw that word around in some cultures, and other times people won't use it at all. And there's lots of other terms in, especially in the paranormal community, where some people just will not say a certain thing for any number of reasons that don't need to be good or bad, but it's just, it's something for us to kind of get caught up on, where you're missing the forest for the trees, in that
Yeah.
sense. I think a lot. And I think that, again, that's why these stories, especially for someplace like Revelstoke, were so kind of like poignant for me, is like for how far away that is from like my experience growing up outside of Pittsburgh.
Right.
Unfortunately, I will probably never get to that part of British Columbia. Maybe I will if I'm lucky, but I probably won't. At least I haven't yet. But I can tell you, listening to these stories, us and our listeners here probably have a lot more in common with those folks than not, regardless of cultural boundaries, regardless of time, regardless of any of those things, whether they've experienced things or not. And I think that anything that can help us feel connected is
Oh yeah.
is a really really positive thing, and worth kind of looking into. So that's why I think like this kind of work that you do, putting these books together, not only is it fun, but I think it does serve like it serves an important purpose, I think, for bringing everybody together.
Oh,
um
thanks, man. I really appreciate that.
like
Yeah, that means a lot because again, I did Strange and I didn't know what to expect.
mhm.
And, because again, it originally came out in 2016. I kind of thought it would be like transformative somehow because I didn't know jack all about
Yeah,
publishing books, right?
right.
And it wasn't, but
Mhm.
it led me to meeting Ian, with whom I started the show way back. And that kind of put me, and like things have evolved since then, but like it put my life on a track and it wasn't an
Yeah,
immediate thing, but it didn't have like even now, again, it's out and it's going to be in print for 10 years thanks to Beyond the Fray.
yeah.
But
Mhm.
it doesn't, sometimes it feels like it doesn't have much of an impact.
Mhm.
And so hearing that and knowing that people are still enjoying it is really gratifying. I appreciate it.
Absolutely, man. No, for sure. And I think that like when it comes to cataloging this stuff, like we were talking even about like the podcast and everything. One of the things I've been thinking about with that, because of just some feedback that we've gotten from people on just our small little community, is the idea of, we mentioned that these experiences happen on a spectrum, whether they're good, bad, or in the middle, but a lot of times they are very impactful to people. And like you mentioned, with the kind of perspective a lot of people have in Revelstoke and a lot of other places, there's still a lot of, it isn't as easy for people in certain situations to talk about their experiences.
Oh yeah.
So anytime I think people can feel heard, whether they're the ones physically telling the stories or if they can hear someone else going through something similar, it helps people feel connected, and it does have some real value to it. And that's why I think, especially when you have these like really really weird stories, it's like you think like okay, there's no way anyone else out there has had an experience like this, and then it resonates with somebody.
A quick one before we
Yeah.
wind up is, in the book I talk about my experience. I thought it was a dream. I still think it was a dream,
Hmm.
but I used to just scared to sleep in my room. Didn't know why. So I'd
Hmm.
sleep in my parents' room before they came upstairs to bed. And I remember laying in their bed with the light on, looking out the door and seeing this line of people coming up the stairs, going down
Hmm.
past that room, down the hallway, and down the hallway was my room.
Hmm.
One of them was like a lion man, like
Oh.
like a man in a lion costume maybe, or
Hmm.
but he looked like a lion man.
Yeah.
And he saw me see him and he started screwing with me. He started going like "Rrr," like trying to scare me,
Like trying to be like, yeah, okay,
and
yeah.
it was like he was trying to get a reaction from me, and it scared the
Hmm.
crap out of me. And to the
Fair.
point that when Quentin Tarantino's Jackie Brown came out
Hmm.
in 1997, I was 14 years old at that point.
Hmm.
This happened like 9, 10 years before.
Yeah.
There's a song on the soundtrack. I think it's called like from like Vampire Sound Overkill or something, or Vampire
Hmm.
Sound, but I think it's called The Lion Cucumber, and it's got this guy going "Rawr" in the background. It still kind of, it scared the crap out of me, and it still kind of freaks me out because it takes me right back there. But we had a message from a listener. When she was younger, she went into, as I recall, the spare room in her grandma's house because her grandma sometimes kept sweets in this one tin.
Yeah.
She heard a noise. She looked behind her, and there was like a tiger man standing there.
Like, that's so wild.
Yeah.
Like, because again, and like maybe you, like, odds are you two are not the only two people to experience that, probably. But
there was another
the
story.
fact that no one else has come up with, like, I haven't heard that before. So that's just wild.
I used to do a patron show called Book of the Dead, which was just three stories back to back to back every episode. And one of them, I don't remember the animal anymore, but one of the last ones I did, there was an animal, like an animal man, and it just ran at this guy and just scared the bejesus out of him.
Wow.
So it's, we actually did a whole story called You're a Strange Animal, or sorry, whole episode called You're a Strange Animal, about like strange animal stories.
That's fascinating. Yeah, and it's just, and like I said earlier, like, just these rabbit holes you don't plan to go down sometimes are the ones that, like, have the most to them, which, like, is just never, like anything, it's never what you expect, you know.
No, that's it.
And again, that's why I like this book so much, is for, like I said earlier, how many of the boxes these stories check from a bingo standpoint. Like, in this book, we have, plenty of UFO stories. There's plenty of, supposed Sasquatch sightings. There's plenty of other just like high strangeness that's just like weird feelings and weird vibes. But there's so many stories that just don't go the way you expect them to go, and to have so many in such a small, isolated geographic area, whether or not it's unique, it's still special. So I mean, I really appreciate one, you writing this book, two, you having this conversation with me and all of our listeners tonight.
I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. And so before you go, where can people find both your book and your podcast?
So the book is available on Amazon. Again, it's a strange little place, The Paranormal Secrets of Revelstoke, British Columbia. I'm about a third done the audio version. That should be out sometime soon, maybe in the next couple months. Let's hope. You can find me. I'm Large of the Truth on Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, and Letterboxd if you want to follow me and all the movies I watch. And the show, my podcast, The Ghost Story Guys, that's at ghoststoryguys.com. You can get that everywhere fine podcasts live. And also you can find us on Instagram as The Ghost Story Guys. And in September, I'm going to be launching with Brandon Scheck-Snyder, who's the host of Southern Gothic, a new horror fiction podcast.
Oh.
And we're not giving the name out yet because we're not launching till the 2nd of September. But it will be a daily spooky fiction podcast, 2 stories a day, 5 days a week.
Ooh.
And
I'm interested.
I've written 550 pages so far of short stories, and I've heard some what Brandon's done. He'll be narrating it and hosting it. It's really great. So follow at the Ghost Story Guys on Instagram, and you'll be the first to find out when that drops. But it's a very exciting project.
That's super exciting. Well, we're gonna have to talk more about that in the future, I think.
That'd be awesome.
And obviously we'll have all the links and everything for anyone who's listening in the show notes, no matter where you're listening. So, well, again, thank you so much, Brennan. And if anyone out there has any questions, you can reach out to us, as always, on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube at The Ghost Furnace Podcast, or The Ghost Furnace Podcast at gmail.com. Again, thank you so much, Brennan. You have a wonderful night, okay?
Hey, you too, man. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.